Hello everybody and welcome to episode 49 of Life and Life Only, and this is part 3 of 3 of our exploration of the book Life and How to Survive It by Dr. Robin Skynner and John Cleese. I'll naturally direct you back to the first 2 parts, particularly the first one. Obviously it's a good starting point, but I also talked a bit more about the book itself. It came out in the early 90s and is presented as an ongoing conversation between a doctor, which is Robin Skynner, and an ex-patient of his, John Cleese, who also happens to be obviously a famous comic actor, if you're familiar with Monty Python, Fawlty Towers, Fish Called Wanda, and various other things. So I won't say any more because although we are technically on the home straight, you know what home straights are like, especially with a book that's got so much here. As before, I'll just be interjecting throughout and possibly going into tangents. But as I said before, I don't plan these interjections and tangents. I just start reading and let things go where they go. And then, of course, I edit pretty carefully. So what you'll be hearing is a much smoother version of this actual recording. I'll just get the plug done at the beginning of this episode as well. I am a life coach. If you're interested in life coaching, very affordable life coaching, or you know somebody who might be, please write to me at lifeandlifeonlypod@gmail.com. And if you'd like to help out the show, there are links in the show notes, PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. In case you don't know, I actually have 3 podcasts, and when I do ask for donations, it's really for the work across the 3. The other ones are Glass Onion on John Lennon, obviously about John Lennon, but also sometimes generally about the Beatles, and expanding into society, for example, taking a year such as, for example, 1967, which we did fairly recently, and looking at the year itself and then looking at John Lennon and the Beatles' part in it. The other podcast, which sometimes gets neglected, but I will have a 3-parter coming out over the summer for that one into the early autumn. That's Film Gold. So without further ado, when we finished part 2, I read a few bits from a very long section on religion, and now we're going to look at religion in the spiritual sense. So John says, presumably there's also a purpose that's more to do with the spiritual, which would be a higher purpose, a higher value still for those who believe in such a force. Robin, fair question. Well, I have to make a bit of a leap now, so I hope I can take you with me. I have to refer back to what we said about the most healthy people, that they have a strong sense of connection with the cosmos. John, you called it a feeling of being plugged in. Robin, yes. Now, of course, we can't help being a part of the universe. We're part of it whether we like it or not. But there's an element of choice in whether we recognise the fact, and therefore in whether we feel we're a part of it, and so have that sense of connection, of belonging. John, and most people don't carry that feeling with them most of the time, do they? I don't, and I admit that in my capacity as a spokesman for the mid-range. That's mid-range of mental health, which was covered in the first 2 parts. Robin, no, the majority of us don't have that same sense of connection that the very healthiest folk experience more fully. A deep emotional feeling of being involved in the whole cosmic setup, connected with it in a harmonious and pleasurable way. John, you've called it a sense of the universe as a giant support system, and you're saying that this feeling is something that the most healthies are experiencing most of the time. Robin, yes, and of course it's affecting the way they think too. John, are you hinting that this kind of feeling is some sort of spiritual experience? Robin, I believe it's the most basic form of it, yes. John, have you had any kind of spiritual experience yourself? Robin, yes, an awareness of that kind has slowly developed over the years, and there have been particular occasions when that understanding seemed to deepen. The trouble is, it's extraordinarily difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced something similar themselves. It's a deep sense of the way everything is connected, which you can't really put into words at all, because you're not really seeing anything new. You're just realising there's more significance in what you've been seeing all the time. But of course that will mean nothing to someone who is seeing the same facts, but not the pattern, the significance of the whole. To use an analogy, it's as if we have blinkers on like a horse, so we don't get a full picture. Imagine that you are looking all the time through little tubes, so that you and I, say, can see little bits of this room we're in, but never the whole room or the design and shape of it, or the relationships of one thing to another. A spiritual experience is like those blinkers coming off. You're getting a completely different impression of the world, but if you try to explain it to someone who's still got the blinkers on, you can't mention any detail they aren't aware of already, and they don't know what you're talking about. You just end up speaking about the clarity and vividness of the impressions you're getting, but can't convey what's new, the big picture. And then Robin talks about his own let's say, spiritual experience, its connectedness, seeing the whole picture made complete sense of all the bits of which it was composed, bits that were rather meaningless when viewed separately. What I mean by the bits is the fragmented way we see the world in our ordinary state of consciousness, and by the whole picture I mean the way you see it all fitting together when you're in the different state of consciousness, which people call a spiritual experience. Now here's an interesting question. John says, how much were you able to retain afterwards? Robin, I couldn't of course go on experiencing the world in that vivid and connected way anymore, though I can remember having done so and have had similar experiences since, and I've never lost the certainty that the world is actually like that it's designed to be as it is. I know it's all right, even at times when I haven't felt all right myself. Now, of course, I have done episodes about meditation on this podcast, and I appeared on Luke's English podcast talking about meditation there. You have to really work at this. A spiritual experience could be had through chemical assistance, which I'm going to get to in a minute in the book here. But I found, when I have been able to sustain my meditation, I've just had little glimpses, and sometimes it takes you by surprise. I've talked before about when I did the 10-day meditation, there was suddenly a point where I was seeing, you might say in my mind's eye, or I saw a vision of myself, and that was quite powerful. It was the first time I'd really seen some visual representation of myself from outside. And I've also had times where I have felt that connectedness, and I have transcended it. And sometimes it's only for, 30 seconds. I don't know how long Robin's experience lasted, the one that he's talking about here. But it often takes you by surprise as well. I don't think you can chase it. I think you can work at it, work at getting yourself in a space where you're not thinking too much and not analysing too much, and you're opening a space, a channel for the magic to happen, which is basically what I believe a meditator has as an aim when they're meditating. And I think if you get this just a few times in your life, you're doing pretty well. So I do know what he means. And then when you're, let's say, back in the busy state, it's sometimes difficult to remember. I referenced last time out about the David Blaine episodes that we did a year or so ago. And David Blaine actually said that he was happy that he wrote down all his thoughts and feelings while he was in the Perspex box, because he'd almost forgotten. As soon as he got out, and as soon as he talked about having 2 mobile phones, which is not that uncommon now, might have been a bit more uncommon 20 years ago. As soon as he got back to that life, it was like he'd forgotten what he learned. So he was happy that he wrote it down. Right, now we get to a very interesting part. I mentioned chemical assistance. Robin reveals that he actually took LSD in a research experiment context. So John sort of kids him. Are you telling me, Robin, that your first experience was drug-induced? Robin, yes, but I had such massive blinkers on at that time, to go back to that analogy, that I doubt if I would ever have allowed myself to have a spiritual experience without a bit of chemical dynamite to blow them off. So the drug temporarily stripped off some of my blinkers and encouraged me to take this side of life more seriously, to investigate it. John kids him again. I think our readers would be shaken by the revelation that you're experimenting with drugs. Now, interestingly, John asked him, did it make you want to take the drug again? And here we kind of get to the nub of it. This is where drugs can give you very, very powerful experience, particularly hallucinogens. But unless you keep taking it, it's not really a long-term solution, either in terms of taking it recreationally, because it's going to hammer your nervous system. And I know quite a lot about that from doing a podcast about John Lennon, because around 1966 or 67, he was doing it at frightening amounts. But also I'll let Robin explain it anyway. He says, for me, it was like seeing a wonderful distant land from the top of a mountain. You knew that no matter how many more times you went up the mountain to look at it again, you still wouldn't get any closer to what you'd seen. To get to it, you had to go back down and make your way along the ground, which I've been attempting to do ever since. So I'm enormously grateful for that glimpse the drug gave me of what was possible. John says, so your subsequent experiences weren't brought about by drugs? And Robin said, no. Did they vary much? Robin, that first experience was different from anything that came after, because there was first the effect of the drug, like the brilliant sparkling colours and the impression that everything was wobbling, and second, the less blinkered view of the world the drug opened me up to. I have since repeatedly had the second time of experience, but since I haven't ever taken a drug of that kind again, not the first. So he's talking about really first of all, the drug high and that somewhat giddy sensation that you feel when you take something powerful. And then you get portals, the third eye, as Terence McKenna talks about. You get that glimpse. And I think Robin has done a good job there of explaining, as I said, the limitations of it, but the way that he is grateful to it. And let's not forget, I mean, LSD, obviously there's synthetic LSD discovered by Albert Hofmann in the late 30s. But then you've got things like mushrooms, magic mushrooms, psilocybin. And Bill Hicks made a good point, of course, that all this stuff grows out the ground. So it's almost like God is saying, perhaps you should use it, experiment with it.
To make marijuana against the law is like saying God made a mistake. You know what I mean? It's like God on the seventh day looked down at his creation. There it is, my creation, perfect and holy in all ways. Now I can rest. Oh my me. I left fucking pot everywhere. I should never have smoked that joint on the third day. If I leave pot everywhere, that's going to give humans the impression they're supposed to use it. Now I have to create Republicans. I believe that God left certain drugs growing naturally upon our planet to help speed up and facilitate our evolution. Okay, not the most popular idea ever expressed. Either that or you're real high and agreeing with me in the only way you can right now. I forgot the code. Is it 2 blinks yes, 1 blink no? Do you think magic mushrooms growing atop cow shit was an accident? Where do you think the phrase, that's good shit, came from? Why do you think Hindus think cows are holy? Holy shit.
Right. So Robin continues, over the years, this kind of deeper awareness and sense of connection has increased so that to some measure it's come to be more frequently touched. To do so is more normal and ordinary, but it fluctuates. There are times when it seems to be nearer, more easy to contact, and more rich and intense, and in between it can seem further away, more of a struggle to attain to, even though you still feel nearer than you were in the past. Now, if you meditate regularly and your interest draws your thoughts more in this direction, the moments of stronger consciousness become more powerful and you feel generally closer to the possibility of it in between. John, what sort of help do you need to bring about this change? Robin, you can read about it in books, but you easily forget about it and don't sustain the search, just like it can be hard to stick to a diet or take adequate exercise or recreation. And you get it wrong, you soon misunderstand something and end up making the opposite kind of effort to what is necessary. So you need a guide, a spiritual advisor of some kind who is really like a coach, someone who has already achieved what you're aiming for and can see what you need to do next and where you're going wrong. Usually you'll join some kind of group for this help, and working with others not only makes it easier to remember your aim and work towards it, but seems to generate more energy of the kind you need. Certainly my strongest experiences of what it's like to be more conscious, more all there, have been while meditating and working with others over a period of time, especially when one is helped by being with others to sustain some unusual effort over an extended period. He mentioned diet there, where he was talking about sticking to a diet. Intermittent fasting and certain diets will bring some kind of higher state. So I think that combined with meditation and also regular relaxation, but proper relaxation, not relaxing in front of the TV. I often find when I'm very tired, maybe mentally tired, even before I go to bed, maybe sometimes in the evening, I'll just sit, shut the light off and just sit in a dark room. And sometimes I think and sometimes I don't. And sometimes I meditate and sometimes I just relax. And that can be quite powerful. But really what he's talking about there, a spiritual advisor and doing it in a group, that could refer to other things. If you think of it in terms of physical exercise, if you have a coach who's very fit and has been working out and exercising for years and years, they can help you. And then if you do aerobics or spinning in a group, that will help you as well. So that's a fairly good parallel there. But if we are thinking of it in terms of physical exercise, to get in a very good state of fitness, think about how long that takes. It's really the same thing. I mean, not the same thing, but it's the same idea. the same approach, the same thing that's required to get you there. I would recommend the work of Rupert Sheldrake. He wrote a famous book called The Science Delusion. I listened to the TED Talk. He also did a talk on Russell Brand's podcast, Under the Skin. I'll put it in the show notes. And he talked about, he was actually friends with Terence McKenna, which seems like quite an odd couple to me. But Rupert Sheldrake is a great speaker, and he talks about having spiritual experiences through various things, including going for walks on what are considered sacred ground. So there's plenty of ways to get there. Physical exercise, as I mentioned, fairly extreme physical exercise, not to the point where it becomes unhealthy, but very dedicated exercise will give you a great high. So I've given you a few things there: meditation, exercise, diet, etc. Proper relaxation, total relaxation. Robin talked about how LSD was like going to the top of a mountain. I'd recommend just going to the top of a mountain on its own. I had a student telling me about a year ago that he's a French guy who was learning English with me. He talked about going to the Highlands of Scotland, and he said it was the most fantastic experience because it's very cold. But sometimes, you can achieve great relaxation in the warm, and a lot of people just love warm weather, understandably. But there's something about the cold, particularly if you're wrapped up warm as well. The air is very, very fresh. I've only been to Scotland once. I haven't been to the Highlands, but I've heard a lot of good things. So yeah, getting away into nature, whatever the weather really, seems to be always beneficial, particularly if you can find a fairly remote spot and you can have that bit of time. Take deep breaths as well. Just deep breathing will improve your life greatly, just that alone. Now, they're continuing to talk about religion and different states, and Robin starts to talk about a mystical, esoteric understanding of religious teachings, which regards our ordinary waking state as mostly made up of imagination, as more like a kind of waking dream where we see others according to our expectations and prejudices rather than as they really are. So we're going back to this idea of reality and not being led by your ego or your subjective thoughts and feelings. We all have those subjective thoughts and feelings, but if you're leading with the ego, you're going to be very steadfast in thinking that they're accurate. So if you have an idea about a certain person you work with or whoever it is, you need to, unless this person really is truly, evil or sociopathic or psychopathic. Most people do generally mean well. So if you have negative feelings, you need to be open to the idea that you might be wrong. So that's where you have to control the ego there. Robin carries on, but the trouble is our lives don't feel like a dream. We think we're fully conscious already, so we don't realise we've been living mostly in imagination until we are aroused or startled into a more alert and attentive state, as we are in the kind of experiences we've been discussing. At that moment we're really awake, seeing things more objectively, but very soon we're back in another dream, imagining we're continuing to be more alert and attentive. So it's extraordinarily difficult to escape from this self-deception unless someone who's already more awake startles us out of these waking dreams by some kind of emotional shock, or gives us tasks to do which bring it home to us by the fact that we can't do them. Now, I mentioned Rupert Sheldrake. He shares with Graham Hancock the dubious honour of having TED Talks that are banned. Now, I use TED Talks in my English classes, but there's definitely limitations. They're very mainstream, and they do often have a political slant. They're also apparently quite controlling. There is TEDx, which is slightly more alternative, but the mainstream TED Talks are, I wouldn't say they're controlled. I'm sure they don't tell the speakers what to say, but you'll find there's a commonality between them. But Graham Hancock said that our society doesn't like drugs like LSD and marijuana because, and this is, call it conspiratorial or call it truthful, whichever way you look at it. Society prefers people to be caffeinated, let's say. So they keep going and they can keep working the proverbial machines. That was another George Carlin line. So could be working machines, could be working in an office, whatever it is. And then alcohol to sort of dull the senses. That's one way of looking at it. I challenge you, listeners, how many times do we breathe a day? Thousands and thousands. I don't know how many it is, but it's a lot. How many of those breaths do you remember? So take the last 24 hours. Do you remember any of your breaths? And if you don't, think about why that is. And I'm not having a go at anyone because I don't generally remember any of my breaths either. It's just when I remember to deep breathe, it very much improves my day. Every time I remember to do that, I just immediately feel better. 10 deep breaths, or however many it is. We are kind of living in a bit of a dream. You can research alpha states and beta states. In one of them, you're alive to the moment, and in the other one, you are conscious of what's going on. Obviously, you're probably concentrating on your job, but there's a way of being conscious of everything that's around you in a slightly more alive way. I mean, I find when I have to work very early in the morning, I kind of enjoy the haze in a way, but then I am quite zombified at the same time, and it takes a bit of time to get me out of my slumber, and that's where a lot of people use coffee, as I said, or caffeine. It could be tea as well. And I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that, but it's worth recognizing. As he said, if you do get someone who's a bit more awake or awakened, if you think of it in a wider sense, they could help you. But I think on your own, you could, as long as you're aware of it. Awareness is so important. They say that if you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, the first thing you have to do is admit you're an alcoholic. That's 50% or more of the battle. So if you acknowledge that perhaps you're not really experiencing every moment of the day the way you could, then you'll be more likely to be able to do that. There's a practical side. We were talking in part 2 about how there's nothing wrong with being practical in your life. You don't have to rely on inspiration all the time. And that's one thing. I do sometimes leave myself a note to remember to take a few deep breaths during the day, or be aware of my breath. And it really does enrich your day. Trust me, folks. They're talking again about the more healthy, mentally healthy folks. And for those who haven't listened to the first 2 parts, I'll just say one more time that they made 3 basic divisions between very mentally unhealthy people. And that's not really in terms of madness or sanity. It's just I would say it's about how you control your ego. Most people are in the middle, maybe 60%, mid-range they call them. And then there are some people who, for whatever reason, just seem to be more healthy in their mind. They maybe seem to be more compassionate, better control of the ego, more generous, those kind of things. So John says, let's get this straight. You're saying that the very healthiest folks are more likely to be drawn towards the so-called esoteric understanding of the great religions. An esoteric tradition will enable a person to become more aware of his or her true self, to gain the self-knowledge which brings an increased likelihood of having these experiences we're talking about, which are often described as mystical, but which you're saying are clearer perceptions of the world. Robin, yes, I think that's probably so, but as I've said, I'm basing that view not just on the research findings, but on a combination of what there is, together with my professional experience of what happens when people become healthier, and my own personal experiences of the relationship between health and spiritual understanding. You're making the link between mental health and spiritual experience a lot tighter than I'm comfortable with. I've no doubt, I've said, that good mental health and the real sense of spiritual connection we're talking about are linked. Each promotes the other. Healthier people do seem to feel a greater emotional sense of connection and belonging, and that sense of meaning and connection is a vital part of health. But I think that something else is required before a person wants to devote their life substantially to a quest for deeper spiritual understanding. Some sense of vocation is probably needed, a willingness to sacrifice many other things to this search, and the more you've got, even in the way of health and happiness, the more you've got to lose. Of course, it's possible that this is the highest form of health there is, but I don't think we can answer that on the basis of your knowledge or mine. I said before that for mid-range people like us, even trying to understand optimal health is like trying to imagine the view at the top of a mountain from halfway up the side. So I think that for us to talk about high spiritual development is like trying to imagine the view at the top of Mount Everest from base camp. So there's a nice analogy there. You can also devote the rest of your life to improving your spiritual well-being. It's a lifelong thing. I used to be quite a chess player. This is a long time ago now, and I keep meaning to go back to it. But I liken it a little bit to that, and I'm not talking about the chess match against someone else. I'm just talking about your level. You could be playing a computer or whoever. It's really about the level that you've attained. It's a lifelong struggle. I also started studying a bit more music theory. You'll know that I'm a musician as well. That probably has a bit more of an end point than chess, but there's something wonderful about deciding that you're going to spend the rest of your life as part of your routine improving a certain skill. And I can't think of a better skill to improve than your spiritual well-being. Again, it could be physical exercise, because that doesn't really have an end either. It's just an ongoing quest. But there's something, I don't know if noble is the word. I'm probably thinking of John Cleese in Monty Python, the Holy Grail, the noble quest for the Grail. But yeah, I think it's a very, very worthy cause. And yeah, just to reiterate, don't look for endpoints. Just think of it as an ongoing voyage. Right, we're jumping forward quite a bit here. And we're going to get to the big daddy, death. Now, those of you who heard the Derren Brown series I did at the end of last year will know that there was long sections of that book about death, and we talked about it a lot. And in a nutshell, I think all of us, maybe not children, but all of us of a certain age, I don't know, when you become an adult, it's worth just thinking about it. Very, very likely that if you're, 25, you've got a lot of living to do. But anyone who reaches a certain age will tell you it does go by quite quickly, and the years roll by more quickly as you reach a certain age. But I think the fear of death, and this has been said in so many books that I've read, could be one of the things that's holding the human race back. I'll probably refer you back to the Derren Brown series, particularly, I think it was the last part, maybe the last two parts 3 and 4, which came out right at the end of last year, to expand on that. But there's a bit about it here as well. John says, while we've been writing this book, I remember how over and over again we've seen that death was at the centre of what we were discussing, and then we would forget about it for months until we realised we'd tuned it out again. Robin, that's because it's surrounded with so much anxiety and it affects us as much as everybody else. John, I see. Now we have in fact reached the topic of, as it were, dying. We can't put off looking at it any longer. Robin, well, we haven't quite got there yet. I know you'll think I'm changing the subject, but we need to talk about the period immediately before death, that part of life when we know we only have a certain short time to live. Going back to the basic principles of what we said about change, the knowledge that we're definitely going to die within a limited time means facing a massive change, a dramatic loss of hope and expectation. So the map of our world is suddenly useless, and unless we've been facing the fact of death and preparing for it earlier in life, we almost have to start again from scratch. So it's a huge stress, and after the initial numbing shock, there'll be a lot of sadness, appropriate to such an all-important loss. Now, in part 1, I read the part where Robin was talking about the death of his wife, and that was through illness, and I think they had a bit of time to prepare for that. What I was going to say earlier, I didn't really finish my thought. If you're 25, let's say, you've got a lot of living to do, but I think it's just worth reading about the general topic, because it's not necessarily death itself. I'd probably say it's mortality. And I believe, this is what I expressed last time, that it's a very healthy thing just to be in touch with your own mortality. I expressed at some point during the Derren Brown series that I said that in a funny way, even being in my 40s, I'm kind of prepared for my death. And I'm quite lucky in the sense that apart from having a family of my own, I've pretty much done everything in terms of personal experiences that I've ever wanted to do. I've been to all the countries I'd like to go to. Yes, part of me would like to see other countries, but I feel like I almost got that out of my system. And the idea of travelling now, they've turned it into such a less pleasurable experience in terms of the airport and so forth, that I don't feel that inclined to travel anymore. But there's other things that I've done. I've lived in a few countries, and I've had some very cosmic experiences, you might call them. Haven't been to space, I'm not claiming that, or to the moon. But yes, there is a way where if you're mentally prepared for something, then if it does come, if something suddenly happened to me where I was living on borrowed time, I feel like I'd be well prepared for it. Of course, I don't know that exactly until it happens, but that's just something I feel. So carrying on with this, Robin says, the less down-to-earth a person is, the more likely they are to rail against fate or blame the doctors or anyone else available or themselves by feeling endlessly guilty, which is really another version of denial of reality. And I think we might have mentioned blame in the last part. This is something that a lot of people do when they can't face their own frailties, and I'm not talking about death here necessarily, but personal deficiencies, let's say. If someone does something wrong, like there's the ego again, they'll want to blame someone else. So in this case, railing against fate seems like the craziest thing, really, because you're railing against, in a sense, the ultimate reality there. John says, is this the feeling that you should be able to control the world and stop anything happening that you don't like? Robin, I think that's what it's really about. It leads into a phase that Kubler-Ross calls bargaining, a reference to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I'm sure this was in Darren's book. Darren's book is called Happy, and Kubler-Ross did a book on death and dying, but she's quite famous for the 5 stages of grief, also known as the Kubler-Ross model. In case you don't know, those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So she's talking about bargaining here. Bargaining is still a hope of controlling the situation, but now by some kind of deal, rather than just an angry demand to have one's own way. John says, who are you bargaining with? Fate? Robin, or God, or whatever. When people react like this, they are doing so with the basic bit of the personality we call the child, understandably wanting some parent to make it all better. But gradually, as reality is faced and the map begins to be redrawn, there's sadness and grief, which, as you said earlier, may be blocked and lead to depression. But if the pain is faced, the map gradually becomes redrawn to accommodate the massive changes that have to be adjusted to, and then the final phase of acceptance follows. Now there's space for positive feelings like love and gratitude and enjoyment of life to return. This is provided the person finally gives up the demand to control this most uncontrollable of events. If you visit a hospice, you'll be left in no doubt about how positive it can be. And then John makes a reference back to Monty Python. He says, and then finally, dead parrot time, becoming an ex-me, discuss. Now, probably everyone in Britain who's listening to this will know about the dead parrot sketch. I can put it in the show notes. Very, very famous Monty Python sketch. Robin says, well, as I don't need to tell you, the answer is no one actually knows. Or if they do, people who claim to have lived previous lives and been reincarnated, for example, the evidence is accepted by some and disputed by others. Of course, it's part of the beliefs of every civilization that survival of some sort occurs, but that just means it's part of the particular myth they operate by. And the myths are different, so they can't all be true or the whole truth. So it's still an open question. Reincarnation and what happens after you die is not something I'm going to get into here. In the Darren Brown book, there was a long section on this as well. Now, somewhat related to death is aging, and I feel that what's happened with age recently is that 70 has become the new 60, for example. I would say almost, maybe even the new 50, I don't know. People are living much longer now, and some people, including my parents, have quite incredible levels of health compared. Now, on my Film Gold podcast, just to quickly mention that again, we've just recorded a big 3-parter on Orson Welles. And Orson Welles died at the age of 70. And if you see him in a final interview he gave, he was quite ill at the time, shortly before his death. If you looked at him now and said, how old is that person? If you imagined he was alive now rather than in the 80s, he died in 85, so we're talking about 40 years ago, people would probably say he's 80 or 85. So I think at least, 10 years have been gained. But I think people are starting to realise that older people or old people do get disregarded by society, and it's a shame because they're still the same as us. It's just it's a question of time. Bill Hicks said something similar about, he used to do jokes about how he didn't like children, but he was using it as a joke. And he said, why do people like children so much, but they like them less when they become adults? And obviously, there's a superficial answer to that people become less cute as they stop being babies or children. But it's a similar thing. When we talk about the elderly, we're almost talking about them as if they're some subsection of society, but they're the same people that weren't the elderly 20 years earlier, if you know what I mean. So John says, regarding aging, are you going to tell me this is an area in which we might be getting healthier? Yes, because of all the lessons we've learned, this is the clearest of all. Certainly for me, life has got steadily better from the age of 18 months, which is the earliest I can remember, to the present time where, as you know, I clocked up my basic 70 a few weeks ago. So that's 70. I have to say, I didn't expect this, and I was surprised to keep noticing it every time another 10 years went by. But it's true. Of course, we're bound to lose some things as we go along, but we should gain others which more than compensate. For example, you lose the joy of drinking 8 pints of Carling Black Label and being sick afterwards in the car park every night. But instead, you can get more enjoyment from fine wines and keep more interesting company. You may not want to have sex so often, but you should enjoy it much more when you do because of the greater depth of emotion you experience as you get older. And I'd add also it might be more special if it happens less as well. In fact, life should get altogether more rich and enjoyable, not least because you should have become a lot wiser and gained more control of your life and of yourself. You're less and less concerned about what other people think of you. So living increasingly by your own values, you become more spontaneous and free in expressing your feelings and making relationships. He carries on with that, and what I really want to say about that is that I think as you get older, the stereotype is that you become more narrow-minded and intolerant. And if anyone remembers Harry Enfield, the old git. But I think, and I feel like might be happening a bit more. A lot of people are retiring and suddenly finding that because they've paid their house off, for example, their mortgage, they're out of the system. They're free in that regard. And I think a lot of people do start to use retirement, and I try to encourage my parents to do this, as a time to be almost reborn. Reinvent yourself, perhaps. I wouldn't like to go back to being 18. I mean, I wasn't particularly happy when I was 18 or 21 or really 25. It was from about my late 20s onwards I started to feel a bit happier and more comfortable in myself. But what he says there, I mean, that applies about caring less what people think. Unfortunately, society has got a word for that, midlife crisis or letting yourself go. Maybe you start, I don't know, you might put on a bit of weight just because you enjoy eating or whatever. Unfortunately, society, this is the kind of outer truth section of the podcast, society seems to have all these, I don't know, almost safeguards to progress. And one of them is that if you get to a certain age and you start, let's say even if you're just 35 or 40 years old, which is not old at all, obviously, you start to talk about how things were better before, or you start complaining about what young people think. People will say, oh, you're getting old, you're moaning, and it's a shame really. But yeah, you do get wiser. And I think you know what you want a bit more than previously. That's what I'd say about that. And John says, I agree with you about life getting better. It's just that sometimes the noise of your body creaking distracts you from the joys of senility. And he is joking there. And Robin says, which is why we all have midlife crises. John says, weekly. Robin, you see, a midlife crisis is simply what happens when someone is clinging to thinking appropriate to an earlier age, and life has to knock them about a bit to make them let go of it. Then they can begin to enjoy other pleasures. That's all quite inspirational stuff, I think. Now, something that is touched on in the book quite a bit, and I've definitely talked about it, is how, and this is related to age again, people get older, they still retain often quite childish thoughts, and that's what Robin was saying, really. You probably won't have a midlife crisis, or it'll be less, if you just try to embrace this different stage of life. John says, you've been telling me the 2 reasons why we get stuck in childish behaviour patterns. One is the denial process, where our family teaches us to put certain taboo emotions behind the screen, and the other is the dog biscuit process, where outdated behaviour continues because it goes on being rewarded. So he's talking about a family situation. That was what their first book was about, as some of you will know, families and how to survive them. And they'd be touching on that at various times through this book. John says, what I'm confused about is the relationship between the 2 processes. Are they just 2 ways of looking at the same thing, or are they partly overlapping? So just to reiterate, denial, and then the dog biscuit is being rewarded for childish, immature behaviour. Robin says, as you'll appreciate, I'm trying to convey in ordinary language ideas which are essentially simple once you grasp them, but where understanding is obstructed by the complicated psychological jargon in which they're usually expressed. These 2 processes are very different. Dog biscuit is just reward and punishment, which influences learning of all kinds and is perfectly normal. It's denial that's abnormal and causes all the problems, because it leads us to avoid facing reality and live in fantasy again. So returning to that theme again. But the 2 of them connect in producing the psychological problems we've been talking about. Here's how. If a family is denied something, any member who expresses the truth will be punished. Those who avoid the truth will be rewarded. Once this pattern is established, there's no escape without outside help, because even seeing that people are denying reality will be denied and even punished too. It's like a crazy school. You're rewarded for giving the wrong answer and punished when you're right. But let me give you an example of both processes in action and how they connect. And he talks about his own childhood from his mother's point of view. She had suffered the most painful kind of loss when her own mother had died when she was 4, and she wasn't really helped to face her distress at the time. So she never mourned her mother properly, but learned to hide and eventually deny feelings of sadness in herself. As a result, she became unduly sensitive to these feelings in others and responded in an exaggerated way when other people were unhappy. She would see much more distress than was really there. She'd overreact and give too much sympathy. John, giving to others what she had really needed herself. Robin says, now here's a situation from my point of view. I was the eldest in the family, and so an only child until my next brother was born when I was 4, the age at which my mother had been bereaved. I naturally got distressed when he arrived, jealous and miserable and difficult, but instead of just giving me a reasonable amount of support and comfort, while also letting me go through the pain so I could get over it, she tried to relieve my distress too much. So the normal distress reaction that all children of that age get to the birth of another child was over-rewarded, which meant I got stuck with a proneness to sulking and self-pity. Very interesting. So then John asks him, how does denial come in from your point of view? Robin, well, my mother's overindulgence of me was a result of her denial of her grief at her own mother's death when she was a child. She'd put that behind the screen, and when I showed a similar, if less intense, grief at losing my exclusive relationship to her when my brother was born, it would have threatened to re-arouse her own buried feelings of sadness, more so perhaps as I was the same age that she had been when she lost her mother. So she worked overtime to counteract my distress by giving me a giant and particularly tasty dog biscuit every time I looked sad to get me to stop showing that feeling. John, instead of letting you feel sad, which was an appropriate reaction to your loss of specialness, and supporting you through it. And Robin says yes. So that was a nice example of how these two things are linked. And of course, we have this expression, skeletons in the closet. Every family has got skeletons in the closet. Most families, the vast majority, have got things that they deny. You'll often find when families get together, there's certain things, if someone brings them up, everyone starts shuffling in their seat. I don't think you can get away from that, but in the end, it all comes down to whether you hide these things behind the screen, which is the phrase that Robin and John use in this book, or you just let them out. And sometimes you have to let them out gently, you know. It's like we were saying earlier, it was in part 2, I think, where they talk about chaotic families, really, really dysfunctional families. If someone comes in to try to fix it, you have to start with baby steps. Just start with gently trying to bring these things out and try and get everyone to understand why they're happening. That's why therapy and life coaching as well. Life coaching is, I've described it before as a kind of a low-level therapy. Sometimes it goes deep, though. Have had that experience. But therapy, sort of more high-level therapy for things like severe anxiety or severe depression, it's quite a long, drawn-out process because you just have to tease the answers, if you want to call them that, or tease the improvement in the situation out. Something that has come up already in the things that we've been talking about is to do with change and the confusion and discomfort that comes when things change. And that could be a diagnosis from a doctor of something serious. It could be entering a different stage of life, as we've seen. John says, I want to return to a central paradox, the fact that it's the healthiest people who are more interested in getting healthier. Robin, well, it's not that the desire to get healthier will be the conscious motivation for most people. They'll just be drawn to situations that are challenging. But remember also that 40% of all the men selected as exceptionally healthy by the Harvard study, that was mentioned in part 1, receive therapy at some point in their lives. John, so the people who've already got mental health want more, while the people who have less are fully satisfied. Robin, well, let's put it that way. The further down the scale of health you go, the greater the dislike people feel towards change of any sort, because it's much more painful for them to face their defects. It's easier to cope by clinging to the belief that they're already healthy, in fact healthier than everyone else, and then they can believe they don't need to change. So we're back to denial again. Till, of course, they are brought up against reality by some new situation they can't cope with at all. John, so less healthy folk don't seek to change. They only do so involuntarily if they're forced to by a crisis. Robin, yes, a crisis being a situation when they realise that their usual way of approaching things is not working, or to put it another way, a situation where it is less painful to change than to stay where they are. Yes, very interesting. And when I was saying earlier about baby steps, if you, for example, let's go back to physical health, if you start exercising at the gym, once you establish that habit, or it could be improving your spiritual health, meditation, once you start, in a funny way, it's almost more effort not to do it. And I'm not talking about effort like physical exertion, but it becomes such a good habit of yours. So I think maybe what they're describing here is people who've got good mental health. I mean, it might just be because they were very lucky in the lottery of life to be in a very healthy family growing up. But I definitely think if you start improving things, then it becomes, I don't know, fun after a while, I suppose. And you get more interested in continuing to do it, but you've just got to get started. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I mentioned chess earlier. The other thing is I'm trying not to lose all my Spanish that I learned living in Spain. Writing is another one. Those are probably the three things that if I could wave a magic wand, I'd be doing those three regularly. The fact I've got to pack them already into a busy life is another question. That's a more practical get out clause I've given myself, but there's definitely a psychological thing as well. We are reaching the end. I mean, it's up to me how much of this book I want to read, really, but we're reaching quite near the end of the book in terms of the bits I've been cherry picking. Now, here's a very good subtopic, learning about ourselves. John says, there are so many different activities in which we could engage. Is there anything that might indicate the sort of thing that would be particularly beneficial to us individually? Do we need to take on what we dread the most? Should I become a mountaineer or even a Morris dancer? Robin, you'd probably learn something very interesting from just trying a bit of climbing, if that's a particularly uncomfortable idea for you, which doesn't mean you need to become Chris Bonington. He was a famous climber from England, I think. Going against a deep-rooted fear or resistance can often break a habit and prove very liberating. You might find out that the fear has a very different meaning to what you assume. In my own case, I discovered that a deep anxiety about taking risks in physical activities had more to do with my mother's worries, and was really a fear of what might happen if I was too bold. Through this, I got back in touch with that boldness and began to enjoy exciting sports. So the object is to learn more about yourself, about which the right changes will happen automatically. John says, second and last, an objective question. What would you say were the ultimate objective criteria of whether something is helping us to become mentally healthier? Robin, the ultimate criterion is whether it is taking us towards an increasing integration of the various parts of the personality, an increasing connectedness and communication between them, which will lead in turn to a greater contact with and understanding of the reality outside ourselves. When that's happening, your life gets better, your relationships improve, you become more effective and successful, you stop worrying so much and enjoy life more. As you're going alone, you may feel at times that you're getting worse, so you have to trust that the truth heals, that if you're learning more about yourself, meeting a wider range of people and learning to get on with them and taking in the feedback they give you, you're going in the right direction. Of course, it helps to have contact with others who, as far as you can judge, are healthier rather than less healthy than yourself, though of course that's a bit uncomfortable, and also with people who are trying to grow and change, perhaps just through informal friendships or maybe in some kind of therapy or consciousness-raising group. As I don't need to tell you, this is exactly what groups do so well, and it's why I took up group therapy as my own main interest. Very nice. Now, there was another section that I was going to read, but that just feels like a perfect place to end. So just really to sum up my own feelings, what has come out of this, and of course I would encourage you to read the book. I did read the family's book that they did. That one's obviously more specific. This book is fairly sprawling in a way, but there are, as you've heard, if you've listened to all three parts that I've done here, there are themes that constantly come back. And I'll just reiterate one more time what I got from Robert Greene in a podcast beginning of this year, and I've said it a few times now. Reality is the best thing you've got. And if you're going to live an authentic life, which is 100% the best life to live, you've got to get in touch with your reality, and you've got to try and embrace who you are. Okay? I know that's difficult if you've realised that you have very, very dark aspects to your personality. Unfortunately, I can't speak for everyone, but if we talk about, I don't know, what I would consider normal people, which is what I consider most of us, we're all gloriously abnormal, of course, and we're all probably a bit mad. And I believe something like depression is on a very, very wide spectrum. We all have feelings of depression. Take comfort from the fact as well that almost all the feelings you ever experience will be experienced by someone else, or will have been experienced in the past, but probably are happening at this very moment. Like I say, in my life coaching, one of the skills is to try to, I tailor what I say to the person, to the coachee or the client, but there are broad principles, and another one would be to try to live every moment of the day. That great philosopher Michael Caine, famous British actor, I think I've read all three of his autobiographies, and the last one of the three, Blowing the Bloody Doors Off, which is a reference obviously to a famous line in the film The Italian Job, is almost a bit of a life coaching manual. Now, one of the things I've said about Michael and Paul McCartney and Ringo, various people, they do live in a slightly different world. They've been famous, in the case of those three, for 50, or more than that, 60 years, I guess. But they've also seen a bit of life. So the advice that Michael gives, among many things, there's a couple that stand out. He said one called use the difficulty, which is when you're going through something difficult, depending how difficult it is. That's why it's so difficult to talk, to try and reach everybody in terms of your situations. But use relative difficulty to enrich the experience. And the other one he said was that, he wakes up at, I think he said 6:30 or 7, and he goes to bed whenever he goes to bed, 11 p.m. He says in that 17 hours or however long it is of waking life every day, he tries to be alive to every moment. And I don't know if he meditates. I don't think you necessarily need to. Obviously, I encourage meditation, but yeah, try and be alive to the moment. And as I said, be in touch with your reality. And on that note, I would like to say thank you for listening, particularly those of you who have listened to all three parts, although I'm not discriminating. You can pick it up at any point you want. I know there's people out there who've listened to, or they're just getting to the end of episode 49. That will be 49 episodes of Life and Life Only that they've listened to, sometimes more than once as well, which is incredibly flattering. Episode 50, I've got planned in my head, and if my plan goes to fruition, it will be kind of a special episode in the sense that it'll be quite different to all the ones we've done before. And it will be hopefully to do with, let's say, ordinary people and what they think about various things in the world. That's all I'm going to tell you, just in case my plan goes sideways. But in any case, episode 50 will be along fairly soon, I'm going to say. So one more time, thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves and see you soon. Goodbye.
This parrot is no more. It has ceased to be. It's expired and gone to see its maker. This is a late parrot. It's a stiff, bereft of life. It rests in peace. If you hadn't nailed it to the perch, it would be pushing up the daisies. It's rung down the curtain and joined the choir invisible. This is an ex-parrot.
Well, I'd better replace it then. If you want to get anything done in this country, you've got to complain till you're blue in the mouth.